Hello and welcome to an animation methods tutorial. I say animation methods because the focus of this is not setting up the bone structure or the technical tools for how to get your bones in the right place, but rather the whole process that I go through in creating an animation. And just the thought process involved, what I'm thinking behind every sort of movement or decision, and just kind of the workflow to how to get there in a way that's not wasting your time and it doesn't involve too many retries. It's really a forwards progression. So I'm going to start out just the default pose. I'll do a slight introduction of the way that this character's rig is set up. Basically, I've got a pretty standard IK control system for the hands and feet, and then I have elbow and knee poles that describe make sure that they stay in line. And your rig doesn't have to be the same as mine in order to pick up the important part of this tutorial, which is basically the process of putting in keyframes but paying close attention to timing and the correct sort of exaggeration or movement that the body undergoes. And a lot of what I do for the animations is really kind of pose myself in these positions and try to focus on one element of my body at a time, such as like the way your shoulders roll, depending. So another important thing that this tutorial assumes is that you set up your bone structure to be mirrored, which basically means that you've got all your bones named left and right extensions, so that way when you've got one set up, you can copy paste it to the other side like this. Another thing that I won't go into in this tutorial, but is also very useful, is this plugin called Flip Animation, which can help you duplicate animations in the reverse direction without painstaking copy and pasting over, such as a roll animation that you'd like to do in both directions without having to redo the whole animation. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and show you some of the animations that I've done so far, so you can kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. Now, all these are game animations, so the important thing is that they end up looking straight forward, and there's no movement from the root. Now, some game engines will remove the root movement itself, but in this case, we really just want to keep it around the origin, just because it's a good practice. So these are some movement, some rolls, um, just that have like a very solid flow. There's dropping a little bit of frames because of the screen capture software, but you can still get a good idea that these are pretty solid animations that have a good flow and feel good. And you might think that a lot of the sort of tricks that I use to go faster are a little bit excessive, but I think it's important to find the fastest way, because anything that suddenly you're wasting time, or you have to go back several steps because of something that could have been maybe a little bit cleaner, means another reason to sort of want to give up or kind of demoralize your flow, and that's always going to lead to a worse result because you're going to want to put in less time. Another important setup is the fact that I've got this timeline editor on the bottom panel, and then I've got the action editor, NLA editor, in the middle, and then properties on the top. The nice thing about having the timeline on the bottom is you can set your in and out um, for the start and end frame, and you can see the start and end frame down there. But you can also use the shortcuts S and E if you're hovering over the timeline, which those hotkeys won't work for the action editor. You'll notice that I have two swords for this character, and that's just because I haven't yet decided how many of the animations are going to be geared for just holding the sword or the sword just in its sheath. So I try to prepare for both in case that's a choice I want to make later. Another important thing is I recently started using the sort of auto keyframing feature, which is really nice because um, although you can always undo and sort of restore whatever pose you're working on if you like accidentally move in the timeline, it's much cleaner to not have to keyframe all the bones that you're not using, because then you might get a long stretch of time where one bone isn't doing anything, and then suddenly you give it like a rotation and it'll look really jumpy because it's been frozen for the whole time and now it's just moving. Whereas generally it's better to have a bone always moving from one thing to the next, even if it's over a longer period of time, than being held still. It'll just create a much more flowy, good feeling. So one keyframe that you'll see a lot, that you can use a lot whenever you lose yourself, is Option R or Option G or Option S, and those are just clearing out the rotation, grab, and scale um, of your bone structure. I'm gonna start from the rest position, just so you guys can get an idea of how you get to the right pose. I have this sort of motion blur image plane attached to the sword that I use for the slash animations, that I find that looks nice, but I'm gonna hide that inside of the object. One of the important sort of starting off places, I really try to start at the core, the sort of the root bone, the back and spine, because most actions that you're going to carry out as a character are really centered around, you're always leaning forward. In this case, I'm doing a sort of a knockdown animation, like if he gets hit a couple times or something like that, and it sort of throws him backwards, and you sort of get that falling where your arms kind of come up, your legs come up, and you smash against the ground, trying to get a cool look for that. So I'm gonna start with him just sort of like leaning back, and I'm kind of feeling that there's sort of something of like a C shape with that. And really the best way is, you can look up references online, but sometimes it might be a little bit wasteful on time because they're not really gonna find what you're exactly looking for always. So one thing you can do is just stand up and sort of do a slow mo pass through it, like if you were getting knocked, or like have it set up with one of your friends. If you're going to get to hit backwards, how is your body going to sort of try to absorb the impact, or whether it's such a heavy blow, you're just kind of like free fall, almost like a rag doll. Um, and a lot of times an animation like this could be handled, especially in part with a rag doll, which is what I plan to set up. But a lot of times, having an animation that the ragdoll sort of takes an effect from. So like you start in this pose, and then suddenly the ragdoll physics with Collider set up all around the arms and body. Um, this would be a good starting point because it's already sort of flying in that way, so it's not going to have a lot of crazy deformations, which, depending on what you're looking for, might be good. But in my case, I'm trying to get a very sort of realistic, sort of throw and bounce. So one other important thing to note about the way that I've set up my model is, even though I have IK controls set up with the hands and legs, I only set it to two segments as opposed to three, which would include the shoulder. So one reason that I did that is because IKs tend to work really well with just two bones, I've found, but also that way I get free control over moving the shoulder to accommodate for it, and I find that it gives me more control in what the distance that the hands can be away, and the way that the shoulders sort of manipulate, instead of it being a slave to the inverse kinematics. So I'm just trying to sort of figure out a starting position for getting thrown backwards. And a lot of it is just sort of easing and making sure that it looks natural because we've all been around humans our whole lives, I hope. So you should have a pretty good feel of something that looks natural. Sometimes you get a little bit separated from it because you're there's so many technical tools and options inside of 3D animation programs, but you should be able to have a fairly comfortable feel. And if not, you want to sort of like look at your own body as you try to imitate the pose that's on screen and see how that feels to you. um, but for the first key pose, it's important to get it roughly right. But the really great thing about this workflow is you revisit all your key poses soon after you make the next one, so you can kind of see how they flow into each other and get a better idea. And I'm just kind of experimenting, like maybe I want the feet to be closer to the ground, but I'm sort of getting this weird sort of like pelvic thrust kind of look, so that's looking a little bit strange, and I might not know how to solve that right away. um, so I might just come back to it. And I'm still deciding between, are the feet going to be dragging on the ground, or is he just completely lifted off his feet right away? And then I've got a run animation that's on a loop. That looks pretty good. And this is just kind of what I'm working on is getting a solid flow where it feels like there's weight to the character, and it's a believable animation. And one important thing that goes for most processes in pretty much anything, but especially 3D animation, is it's probably going to start out rough, especially if you haven't done what you're trying to accomplish before or many times before. And even if you have, it usually goes through its stages. So whatever you do, I would encourage you not to scrap it or give up. Just like kind of keep like tweaking, and if you need to, you can clean up your animation by deleting like some keyframes, but never throw everything you have away, because if you put enough time into it, you probably have learned something. So there's probably something really good. So I'm just gonna hit S and put the start frame at the beginning, and then give myself some extra room. So I'm gonna start from this keyframe and see what it looks like, kind of throwing him into like sort of a backwards fall. So I'm kind of thinking that a backwards fall kind of over time, you're leaning back and maybe the top of your shoulders is sort of curling up, to sort of get that C shape a little bit. Um, but also, yeah. And then the other thing that I'm thinking is, you tend to see whenever things are falling. I'm sort of thinking of a Street Fighter kind of uh, getting hit. Their chest sort of surges upwards a little bit, um, and they curl up some. I'm also thinking that I might be able to get the hands to sort of come forward and come close to each other, because as you kind of get dragged away, your hands will sort of try to stay in the same position. So I think they sort of get closer to each other over time. And then another thing that I find after I'm sort of making these new poses is I'll sort of select the main bone object, and just kind of like play with the rotation. Actually, I'll just grab the whole all of the bones by just hitting A twice, and then once you've got that, you can sort of you can get the right sort of location, moving up and down. This is especially useful for like runs and walk cycles, but it's also very useful for making sure you've got sort of like the right jump and fall, because there are very, very few animations where the sort of center of gravity of the character will stay in the same place. Um, and so it usually looks good to sort of take advantage of that, of how cool it looks to sort of make it jump up and down. And as soon as you got two keyframes, you really want to start playing with how it's looking. Yeah, so don't be afraid to sort of to move on. And one of the great things about using the auto keyframe add, which is that like red record button at the bottom right corner, is it'll only add keyframes for the bones that you change. So it's really really easy to just work on sort of the core level. And what I'm using here is if you hit period, it'll change your pivot orientation or your pivot point. So that you can use to sort of get the right rotation just a little bit faster, like trying to rotate the body in a from a certain angle as opposed to the average of all the different pivot points. And then it's control comma to switch. And you can also change this in the bottom of the screen. There's a sort of a pivot button. I have it hidden, but it's pretty easy to find. So I'm sort of feeling like the toes are going to be sort of like pulling away, getting them rotated the right way. They're looking a little bit weird, far apart, so I'm not exactly sure what I want to do to fix that. Maybe bring in the knee pulls a little bit. Um, Sort of, maybe bring in the hands a little bit, or rotate them in a little bit. But it's starting to come along, and I'm starting to see where this is headed. And another thing that's important to sort of be thinking about in the back of your head is, where you're seeing these animations from. In this case, since it's the main character, you're probably always going to be seeing them sort of from behind, depending on the camera angle that you're going to be looking for. And these are all I'm making all these animations for games, but similar principles could be applied to movie animations. You just be actually moving it in space as opposed to in place. So you can kind of see how you get this fluid sort of curvy motion is what you're going to be after, because it looks sort of very organic as opposed to sort of a robotic feel, which you can often get um, with with bone structures. One of the common pitfalls that I see a lot of people falling into. Here I am using that sort of like the cursor pivot again. Um, is they don't have enough keyframes to give that circular motion, and instead you have a keyframe on the left and you have a keyframe on the right, and it just slides in a straight line when you really want that that curve, or that acceleration and deceleration. And even though by default all keyframes are set to curve as opposed to linear, like you might notice if you're trying to make a wheel rotate that you get a sort of a speed up and then a slow down. It's because by default Blender has all keyframe blending set to a Bezier curve. And if you want to change that, anytime you can select the keyframes in the timeline, and you can use all three different blending sort of choices, and you can hit T, which I don't know how you remember that. It's just a memorization thing. But if you hit T when you're selected on the keyframes in the action editor or in the graph editor, you can switch them to linear or exponential or Bezier. Yeah, and here trying to make sure that the rising and falling looks right. It's it slows down coming down, so I might maybe pull it down a little bit farther or push in the keyframe a little bit. Um, One thing that you'll notice in a lot of animations is on the high point, you have a little bit of a slowdown because you're changing direction. You're not going to rise and then suddenly start falling the next frame. You sort of hang in the air for just a split second. So sometimes you can sort of simulate that and get a really cool effect where you get that sort of like hanging air time. And I'm, here I'm just using the, Control C, Control Shift V, which allows me to sort of bring that pose to the other side. Saves me a little bit of time, which especially for our hand controls is really fast and useful because the position and rotation of these is pretty much all I'm using to direct where the hands are. And you definitely wanna play around with like how it looks. Just try to move the bones to the pose. Some people are really good at thinking through it without having to test it out, but it's always a good process to involve that. And you can always come back and change it completely later. So one thing that I would relate it to would be writer's block because you just sometimes want to keep moving forwards and you can always come back and completely change everything. But it's important to get started and keep moving. Other than, getting the flow right where you have your hands and legs sort of lifting away from the body as it falls, another important sort of animation, I guess, obstacle that you'll come in contact with a lot is sort of the contact element. You really need to sort of stress the contact, especially when you're working with less realistic characters. But even so, it's what assigns weight to it. When you're interacting with the ground or with something that it collides with, you want to have almost a slight stretch into the collision, so that it emphasizes how much the impact of the collision is. And I'm going to notice that it falls a little bit slow, so I'm going to move that a little bit closer and rotate it a little bit farther because it seems like has this great rotation and then suddenly he just starts falling straight. And one of the things that's sort of an abstract thing you have to keep in mind is all these animations are going to be applied with some sort of force that's applied in the game engine to the object that this armature structure is parented to. So he's moving backwards this whole time. Now the great thing is we sort of understand, or maybe it's just something you would pick up over time. Um, an animation that looks good, even though it's in place, sort of like treadmill animations. So you can kind of pick up whether you're going in the right way. And the beginning of this animation is looking all right, but the end is looking a little bit stiff. And I have a feeling that might be just because since it ends right there, it feels weird because you're waiting for him to sort of spread out on the ground. So I think I'll sort of dive into moving forward, and I'll try to get rid of this sort of pelvis area that's looking a little bit strange by sort of dropping it down. Early on, you're gonna want to keep basically all your keyframes in the same frame, like move everything, all the bones change at, frame 0, frame 5, frame 10. They don't have to be even increments like I happen to make with some of these. But you want to keep them all the changes on the same line because that makes it for really easy early adjustment. That way you sort of scale up the whole animation without it being too confusing. But as you get later, you'll notice that, especially in real life, hands and arms and bodies and spine, they don't all move in sync. Whenever you look to the side, your neck might look faster, and then your head, sort of catches up, and then your neck sort of rotates back some. Will give you a much more natural head-looking movement than just moving both of those bones at the same rate, or with different keyframes at the same time. It's going to look unnatural. But at this stage, when you're starting early on with an animation, you really want to focus on the keyframes, getting those around the right area so you can sort of it's similar to the process of modeling, where you want to start off with something very low detail, so it's really easy to make huge proportional shifts, um, without a lot of complex moving around, which is where we are. There's only like maybe 5 or 6 frames that I have a keyframe for several of the bones on, and that makes it really easy to adjust the time scale, or just see what's going on. Yeah, so it seems like the contact is a little bit slow, so I might bring that last frame in a little bit. Um, but it's starting to feel a little bit better. And this is where I start to get into moving the frames, because although I want the impact of the body to be really fast, the hands, really can't fall that far that fast. So I'm going to drag those out. So now you see I'm starting to lean away from having all the bones on the same frames for keyframes. But I also want to bring in the whole body rotating, because if you have pretty much any bones staying still for too long, it's going to show up and it's going to look bad, because in real life, all parts of your body are almost always moving. So you really want to hold on to that principle and really try to be aware of each significant bone, always sort of on its way to the next thing. So I'm sort of feeling that with hitting against the ground, the legs might, curl up a little bit. I know I don't want to destroy the mesh too much with a strange deformation, but the legs might come in a little bit, and maybe he'll even bounce off the ground and sort of spread out a little bit more. Will make the impact seem a lot faster and also a lot more intense. Um, it's very important to keep playing over your animation to make sure you're going in the right direction. Another common pitfall that I'll see a lot of people have when they're making animations is they'll spend a really long time on just one frame, uh, and then they'll realize that it doesn't flow very well with the rest of the animations, and they'll have to throw it out, or they'll hold on to it because they become so attached to it because they've put so much time into it, and then the animation really suffers. So you really just want to start off making, the really big adjustments, like, moving the back and head really large amounts. We're not doing any fine tuning really at this point, because everything is subject to change. Everything is subject to be, made faster, slower, or moved in a completely different place. So there's no reason to try to get a beautiful looking pose at every frame. We're just trying to get the overall of the animation. And this is going to save you a lot of time, but it's also going to make you a way better animation at the end, because you're working with something that has, looked good in the overall movement the whole time. You can have a really nice, first frame and a really nice second frame, but there's a good chance that those frames will not carry into each other very well at all. And fine tuning is always a process that comes at the end. If you try to, fine tune a drawing at the early stage, and you make a beautiful, hand, and then you realize, the hand's in the wrong place, the arm can't lead to that position, you're just, you kind of confront yourself with, oh, am I going to lose some of the integrity of this drawing, and, hold on to this work that I put in because I put in so much, or am I going to erase the whole hand and do it again because that's, what would be right. So you really want to just hold on to the integrity of your animation and allow it to be as good as it can be by not throwing a ton of time into working on a small part of the animation when you don't even know whether you're going to change it in big ways. You'll see all I'm really working with is the handles for the hand and the legs and the main spine and occasionally the head. I'm not, worrying way too much about the feet or even the hand orientation. I'm just doing the very overall movements. And you can see I've got a pretty good flow, but there's definitely some timing issues. It's a little bit slow, but I'm also dropping some frames, so I'm having a tough time with deciding whether it's the screen capture program that's slowing it down, or whether it might be just the animation is a little bit too slow in itself. And as long as it's proportionally slow, it's not as big of an issue because it'll be easy to fix. But you also have to factor in hang time. If if uh, if the character's moving really really fast, it probably looks a lot better than just in place. So it's looking a little bit stiff, definitely especially with the arms as it's hitting the ground. So I might start to go into there, and that'll give me a better idea of whether this is looking right. He probably bounces a little bit too far off the ground, and the fall back to the ground looks a little bit strange. But first, I'm going to sort of get this hand motion right, and it's very important to sort of trace uh, how the bones are reacting to movement. There's the main bones like the spine and basically the spine and root that sort of control where the weight of the character is going, and then potentially everything else is just along for the ride and really isn't trying to go in that direction. So what that means for these guys is they're resisting the movement. They're sort of the hands are curling up as as the arms come to the ground, and you can see that if you sort of move yourself, if you move your body, your hands, if you let them fall or sort of dragging behind. So starting to get a little bit better feel with the hands, and I'm not sure if I copy pasted them over because the other one's looking a little bit stiff, so I might go ahead and do that real quick. And yeah, don't forget to save very often. You want to save and even make new versions, because one thing that I've realized is um, you can easily miss an animation if you don't give it a fake user. It's very important to hit that F key on the side of your animations when you're working on it. If you're working on more than one animation, so that it saves it. Fake user meaning that it's giving it another object that doesn't exist to hold on to the animation so it doesn't get deleted. So one tweak that I'm doing here is I feel like the legs will have a tendency to come closer and closer to each other as they fall, because that's going to allow them to stretch further. Just like when they come in, they're going to spread out a little bit because it's a natural pose, and I'm going to have them spread out a lot at the end because it's a very relaxed pose to have your legs out. Whereas when you're getting pulled away, your legs are going to come in close together because that's how they'll be able to stretch out to resist the movement the most. And then it also looks a little bit strange from the side because the legs are so in sync. So I'm gonna take one of the legs and sort of like raise it up a little bit and make it hit the ground at a different time, but also sort of have this bounce, uh, sort of almost making it look like it's pushing a little bit against the ground. One thing that's important when you're placing keyframes is there might be a frame right next to where you have your last keyframe that you really could use a sort of change of direction, and the problem with that can be it'll make a big jump because you're going from one keyframe to the next in just one frame, and you've got a huge shift, even if it looks good the frame before. So a lot of times you just want to push one of the frames back so you can get that. And here I, just watching through it a bunch of times, and save every time you look through it is probably a good practice, you know. And I'm sort of deciding at this point that he's not going to be holding the sword when he hits the ground. Um, whether I set that up as a ragdoll where he lets go of the sword and it flies away, or whether there's some sort of sheathing action. I'm not sure, but I'm gonna go ahead and hide that. And now I'm just kind of for fun simulating the sort of movement that I might be adding to it in the game engine, sort of see how it feels, and it's starting to look pretty good. Now I'm starting to get into sort of the tweaking phase that I was talking about. Now I'm moving the shoulders and playing with the more specific movement, trying to find where it's looking really strange and fixing that. And the first thing I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the leg, control copy, control shift V to get it to the other side, so I can really quickly sort of mirror the arms coming together over time, because that's what's going to happen. They're resisting the pull towards the ground, and the hands can be farther away by coming closer together. Um, and it also emphasizes when they hit the ground, they'll fly to the side. There's a little bit of a weird frame in between when it shifts from the hands coming down that I sort of need to make more of an arc. And now I can sort of play with, I've decided that the hands are in generally the right place, so now I can sort of have more fun with getting the fingers, curling up and spreading out as I like, and it's all based on the hands being in the right place, and then I can copy paste it to the other side, Control C, Control Shift V, really fast, and then pretty fast as the hands get pulled away, they're maybe a little bit less strict. I'm just gonna go ahead and use Alt R to sort of clear it to the more rest pose, and then I can sort of curl up the fingers a little bit there, and bring the thumb in. And this is more just a relaxed pose, because at this point he's sort of drifting and the hands are resisting movement. They're not being stressed out to be straight. So I'm just going to copy it over to the other side, and it feels a lot more natural now. And that's definitely one thing you'll notice with a lot of animations. The hands are very telling, and how much time did see, here's a weird pose. Yeah. Let me try to fix that. It's just the hands coming from one point to the next, and the elbows are getting in the way because for a little bit they're really close together. Whereas it would look a lot better if I had them come down in a more sort of curvy motion instead of straight. And this is where the elbows are going to come in handy a lot. And I'm using the Control Copy, Control C, Control Shift V a lot here, just to speed along, making both arms be at the same place. So now I'm going to sort of delve into making the hands bounce up and resist the sort of the bounce of the body at the right angle. Because when you hit the ground, your arms slam into the ground, your body's already bouncing up before your hands are following suit. So there's sort of have a little bit of a time lag in that sense. And also make it look more realistic in the sense that, oh wow, this body's bouncing off the ground. You can see the hands sort of flopping around. And I don't want this sword to sort of clip with the ground in case you get knocked over while the sword's in the sheath. So I'm going to make sure that is working all right. And of course, when they hit the ground, this is the perfect time to have your fingers sort of snap back. You know, they're still very limp. You know, allowing the physics to control how they're bending. So right before they hit the ground is where they're going to be curled up the most, and then you can have a really pretty sort of snap as they make contact with the ground and all that forces in the fingertips to sort of snap out. And I'm gonna use Alt R and Alt G to sort of clear that out so I can get a quick intermediate to where these fingers are going to be. I'm going to have them bend out and have the thumb sort of rotating back as well. And then I can go ahead and copy paste this to the other side if I grab them real quick. I only grabbed the first couple fingers, so it's only gonna grab those. So the other side's gonna look a little bit strange until I get all of them. There we go. Yeah, so this is looking a lot better. Although because I added that snap, now when it falls the second time, it's looking a little bit strange. So what's going to happen is on the sort of the second re-entry towards the ground, when the hands bounce up and then are coming back down, I need to have them curl up again. And I'm just going to separate the feet because it's looking a little bit strange that they're, so perfectly aligned. I'm just going to delete any keyframes that are too close, move these a little bit apart to give it a little bit different timing. And just kind of have them hit at different times, which is a little bit more natural because they're more free flowing, and you have to be aware of what the character is sort of like actively using his muscles and bones to control, and what's just happening because they're sort of knocked around, or they're just kind of going limp. So yeah, I'm just I'm trying to adjust the body's weight, make sure that um, his body isn't like pushing up against the ground in a weird way, and just playing through it. So I'm just gonna keep trying to get the sword to stay above ground, and you can test this really quickly with just bringing in a flat plane to act as your ground to make sure your character is gonna look how you want him to when he's in the game. And one more time, I'm just going to stress, how important it is to just kind of watch over it and play it, and focus on one specific element at a time. Like, how are the shoulders looking? They look a little bit stiff once they hit the ground. Maybe I'll work on that. How are the legs working? And I'll bring that up in a second. But first, I'm just going to make sure that this head makes contact with the ground in a realistic way, because it's sort of floating a little bit instead of and not really finding its rest fast enough. A cool thing about this character is I've got this bucket for a helmet. So it's got the handle that's on a bucket, and that kind of just bounces around, sort of in a sort of funny way. So I tend to touch that up at the end of the process, and it just kind of gives you a good idea of whether the flow is moving in the right way. And you can see by the keys that I'm hitting is I'm hitting rotate and then X twice, and what that does is it locks me onto the local axis. So basically, since I set the bone for the handle of the bucket, well, since I set that up correctly, it'll automatically rotate in the right direction no matter which way the head is turned, because it's the local x-axis, not the global one. And I'm just going to adjust the timing a little bit, make sure that the spacing of the handle bouncing around looks correct. Scrubbing and playing through it is the only real way to make sure that it's gonna look right. When he's in the game. And another thing that I typically do since the new version of Blender with sun shadows is bring that in and set that up so I can kind of get a good idea of you know, with shadows being cast, how realistic it looks. And the rest is pretty much just making some small adjustments at the end.